Hello, I'm Dr. Ricardo Colella. I'm an associate professor from the Medical College of Wisconsin in emergency medicine. I'm also your medical director, and I wanted to spend a few minutes today talking about the importance of our research. One of the distinguishing features of our EMS system is that we do world-class, cutting-edge research. But with that right comes a lot of responsibility. So I wanted to make sure that you understood some of the issues that are important to research, specifically the consent process. I hope you enjoy the video, and thank you for your time and support. I want to spend a few minutes talking with you about the exception from informed consent concept. Let me first start by asking this question: where would we be without EMS research? If you think about it, over the course of the last 30 years, there have been so many advances in emergency medicine and EMS that would not have been possible without doing good research. When you walk in any airport or shopping mall or public building, it's very common to see an automatic external defibrillator. Also, the idea of performing and improving CPR would not be possible today if it weren't for applying good evidence-based research. So this is critical to the work that we do and the safety of the public. I think it's important to understand that there are three ethical principles that we all follow whenever we're conducting research. The first of them is beneficence. So this essentially is the philosophy of doing no harm to any patient. We do this to ensure that we minimize any risk to patients while maximizing the benefit of research. The second principle is the respect for person. Respect for persons essentially ensures that everybody is autonomous, that we treat them with courtesy and respect, and we allow for the proper consent process to occur. It's important that researchers are always truthful and conduct their research with no deception. And then the third ethical principle is the concept of justice. And what I mean by that is, research should be done that affects all people in a fair and equitable way, with a fair distribution of cost and benefits to all the potential research participants, and that's done so equally. We ensure these three principles to make sure that research is done safely and in the best interest of patients, and all ethical research is founded on these three principles. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the timeline for research because I think it does help frame the discussion about where we are today. Prior to 1993, research was done in a way that revolved around this concept of deferred consent. And what that really meant at the time was that the randomization of research was done at the discretion of the investigator. And basically, it was done as the investigator knows best model. As you can imagine, that kind of deferred consent process had a lot of questions and uncertainties. And in 1993, the Department of Health and Human Services at the time essentially put a ban on any type of deferred consent process and required that for any human research studies, including emergency conditions, that we had to do informed consent. And I think on its face, informed consent certainly is critical and important, but I'll point out a couple of reasons why under emergency situations, informed consent might not always be practical. So what is informed consent? Well, informed consent is when you essentially have a discussion with a patient about an experimental therapy. So an example that I always give is the comparing of one experimental therapy to one that is known, proven benefit to see if experimental therapy is any better than the proven standard of care. This is very common in medical practice and research and industry, where they're looking to see if there are new novel medications or therapies that could be compared to a gold standard. And this is important. However, this is very different from the kind of consent that we do under emergency conditions. With informed consent, oftentimes these are not time-sensitive discussions. There's a lengthy process about explaining the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, some of the side effects of the experimental therapy, what some complication rates could be, how does one exit the study, are there costs that are associated with the research, and finally this hinges on the understanding that patients have a capacity to understand the consent process. As you can imagine, just from my lengthy description, these informed consent processes are very long, oftentimes several pages to go through a consent process, and generally takes a considerable amount of time. And again, this is critical and an important part of our research approach, but you can understand under emergency conditions, informed consent may not always be practical. So I would pose a question of a sudden cardiac arrest. In the midst of a very time-sensitive, life-threatening emergency, it would be very difficult to go through a lengthy informed consent process. As you can see from the slides here, the time to go through an informed consent is not at that moment where you have a critical life-threatening disease. So talk a little bit about cardiac arrest, since that seems to be one of the trials that we're focusing on now. What we do know about cardiac arrest is the following. Nationally, over 90% of every patient who has a cardiac arrest dies, and very few who are fortunate enough to survive the initial cardiac arrest ever have any good neurologic recovery. Many of the drugs that we give in certain resuscitation conditions have no proven outcome advantage. They have poor or dangerous side effects, and they have never been studied to placebo. And I want to spend a minute talking about this because in these kinds of scenarios, placebo may be beneficial or safer. So people always assume that placebo means nothing, but in fact, in many of these trials, placebo is a legitimate arm of a trial, and it may be better or safer. So I think it's important to understand the difference between placebo as in not getting a standard of care versus placebo comparing is what you're giving on a routine basis safe. So it's an important distinction. And I think I've mentioned already that there are unique consent issues about cardiac arrest that make the traditional informed consent process difficult. So getting back to our timeline, as I mentioned before, in 1993, there was a stop on any deferred consent processes to the federal government. But at that time, science and the government understood that this type of emergency research was critical and important in order to address the needs of the community. So in 1994, a U.S. House subcommittee began an arduous process to better understand the issues regarding emergency consent. And through that process, over the next couple years, they have explored many expert panels, they've held public forums, which ultimately led to the FDA issuing a federal rule that pertains to emergency research. So this was a thoughtful and deliberate approach that allowed the idea of emergency consent to be further developed. So as a result of that effort, the FDA released this Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21. This was released in 1996. There are 7 elements to this code that I think are important to discuss, and I think will set the framework for the understanding of an exception from informed consent. The first part of this code is that the human subject must be in a life-threatening situation. Further, the available treatments given to that life-threatening condition are either unproven or unsatisfactory. And along with that, the evidence suggests that doing randomized, placebo-controlled trials are necessary to determine the safety and effectiveness of an intervention. So the first condition is that human subjects must be in a life-threatening situation. The second requirement for EFIC, or again, exception from emergency consent, is that obtaining informed consent is not feasible. So this is always a point of discussion. If you understand the context of truly life-threatening emergencies, like a sudden cardiac arrest, it would be impossible for subjects to be able to give informed consent as a result of the medical condition that they're suffering. Along with that, it would not be feasible to have to try to go through a lengthy informed consent process with family members who are oftentimes under duress during these emergency conditions. And third, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to prospectively identify who would be at risk for participation in a certain trial. One of the questions that we get sometimes is, should we consent everybody in the community rather than doing exception from informed consent? As you can imagine, a population of 1 million people, it's practically impossible to predict who will necessarily be enrolled in a trial, who would be at risk for a sudden cardiac arrest, and the logistics of trying to do that would never allow for any meaningful research to be accomplished. The third condition of EFIC is that participation in this research holds out the prospect of direct benefit to subjects. It's important to understand that current therapy given in some of these emergency conditions has very little evidence to support any efficacy or outcome. And an enrollment in the trial clearly proves some direct benefit to the patient, or I should say at least the prospect of direct benefit, that the current therapy is unproven and that the experimental therapy has a prospect of clear benefit to the patient. The fourth principle is the idea that the clinical investigation could practically never be carried out without a waiver. Fifth, is the identification of a therapeutic window and feasibility. So a therapeutic window is a time interval where if any meaningful intervention is going to be done, it has to be done at a point in the emergency where it would have a chance for outcome. Obviously, to try to do a intervention trial for a disease that has a very short therapeutic window like cardiac arrest is impractical. So exception from informed consent is important when you have diseases that have a very narrow window of time in which one must intervene. And then again, the feasibility to attempt consent would be impractical. By the time you went through a lengthy 10-page document on informed consent to a distraught family member, you have missed the therapeutic window of intervention, and you could understand that the feasibility of trying to consent somebody, it would be impossible. Also understand that the patient would not be able to consent because they have a life-threatening condition. The sixth requirement for EFIC is that there is an independent institutional review board that reviews and approves any of our research protocols. We are fortunate in the Milwaukee County EMS system to partner with the Medical College of Wisconsin and their institutional review board. An institutional review board is a collection of many stakeholders, from physicians, scientists, to the public, ethicists, and others, that review every aspect of any research proposal and continuously monitor its progress. This is a very important concept, and the scrutiny that's delivered in these types of trials that require exception from informed consent are the most rigorous, the most arduous, and the most difficult trials to be approved. So for an organization to get approval for these requires a considerable amount of oversight, and we have that in our EMS system. And then last, there have to be additional protections to the rights and welfare of subjects that are provided through this, through any research trial. And I'll spend a few minutes just talking about what these protections are. The first is before any trial begins, that there is a community consultation process. Now, what this process does is consults with the community through representation to try to get a sense of their willingness to participate in these trials. Now, obviously, it's impossible to consent or consult with over 1 million citizens of the city of Milwaukee. Just logistically, it's impossible to do that. So how this is done is through a series of processes, surveys, random digit dialing, community events, etc., where we gauge the willingness of a community to be able to accept this type of research being done in their community. The demographics of these community consultations must reflect the demographic of a community so that all demographics that live in our county are well represented. The second part is a prior public disclosure. So after the consultation period is through, the EMS system and the research group publicly disclose that this trial will begin, and it's open for public comment. During the course of the trial, there's also a post-public disclosure where people will always have the ability to voice their concern or opinion, any research that's being done, and there are a number of avenues in which that can happen, websites and other communication venues where the public can weigh into the conversation. And then the last additional protection that's afforded is this concept of a data safety monitoring board. And a data safety monitoring board is an independent organization that continuously monitors the progress of a trial to see if there are any abnormalities or trends that would cause the research to stop in either a positive or negative manner. For example, if a trial is going underway that very early on shows clear advantage of a therapy, then the Data Safety Monitoring Board will recommend stopping the trial because the research proves that it's clearly beneficial to a society. And in the negative, if data reflects that the trial does not have any outcome advantage, then the Data Safety Monitoring Board will terminate a trial early. So that Data Safety Monitoring Board is really important to make sure the surveillance of the data is always being done and is always in the interest of patients and their safety. So to give you the practical application of this in the Milwaukee County EMS system, so I'll give you an example of one of the research trials that we're doing in the Milwaukee County EMS system with the Medical College of Wisconsin. So here, for example, we have an organization like the National Institutes of Health, who is the primary funder as well as overseer of a research trial. The NIH, in conjunction with the FDA, are the government agencies that provide the infrastructure and the rules in which we have to follow to do any type of research. Organizations such as the Research Outcome Consortiums, or ROC, is a group of investigators, scientists, physicians, and others across North America that participate in emergency treatment trials. And Milwaukee County has been a site for a ROC for the last 10 years. As you can see from the map to the right, it is a multi-agency consortium across North America that is all committed to doing exceptional emergency medicine research. The Medical College of Wisconsin and its Institutional Review Board and the Milwaukee County EMS system are the partners to deliver this trial locally. And as a reminder, the Data Safety Monitoring Board is an independent arm of the NIH that works with the FDA to ensure that the research is done and the surveillance is done in real time. And it's important to understand that distinction. So let's put this consent concept into context and think about you as the patient. So, for example, let's say you're faced with a life-threatening sudden cardiac arrest. You know that over 90% of people who have this disease will die, and very few will ever have any neurologic outcome. It's important to know that right now, the current state of medicine is such that some of the medications that we use in the resuscitation effort have very little, if any, good outcome advantage, and that the alternative intervention that we propose through these trials would be at least equal to or directly more beneficial than the current medicines. That's a really important concept to understand because we are not comparing an experimental drug to one that is known to work. Really important to understand that. What we are trying to do is make sure we understand that the medicines that we give or placebo may each have their own benefit, and our role is trying to understand which of these medication arms is more effective. Placebo, in this case, may be better than the current drugs we give. You also understand that the window for intervention in sudden cardiac arrest is critically narrow. You have 3 to 5 minutes of intervention time before any further effort will be futile. So really the window for care for cardiac arrest is quite narrow. You personally cannot give consent because you're unconscious and you're having a cardiac arrest. Your family cannot honestly be consented in a way that's informed under duress. We feel that's unethical. Most family members would not be able to understand the consent process under duress, and that's why the Federal Code of Regulations sets up these rigorous guidelines in order to help guide this type of consent process. I want to get back to this first discussion about where would we be without EMS research. Again, remember, when you look around you and you think of all the advances that have occurred in medicine, specifically about public safety and conditions that are emergent, without good, ethical, well-regulated research, we would never be able to advance the science of care. AEDs and good quality CPR would never have been in the public. So if you can imagine the impact that we have had to society by doing this ethical research, you can understand the amount of lives saved across the world. And the work that we have done in Milwaukee County has been the benchmark for the world. We have set the standards of care, and this meaningful work is critically important. It is a process which we take quite seriously. Many of us live in the county of Milwaukee. We would be subject to the same consent process as any other citizen in this community, and we take the work quite seriously. And I think it's important to understand that there is close, meticulous, and passionate oversight of this care and this research. It is important that you understand that we are following very scripted and well-defined rules in order to do this research, and we do it in a way that is founded on the principles of good, solid research. Principles like beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. I hope you found the video educational. Thank you for your time and support. The work that we do here sets the bar for research across the world. The care that we provide here is important, and the care, especially to our patients, is very important. So thanks again for your time and support of our research efforts. Again, it is what differentiates us from so many other EMS systems across the country. I'm really proud of the work that you do, and this work in particular sets the bar. Thank you.